I hate to break the news to you, but you can't go by parasite testing to know whether you have gut parasites or not. In my opinion, after working with over 1,000 chronic skin problem cases, I have come to the conclusion that testing for parasites absolutely stinks. So in today's episode, you're going to learn about the different parasite testing options that are out there, as well as the problems and limitations that impact the results, and what clues you could look for that could point towards having parasites lurking under the surface, even if testing says you're clear. If you have ever really felt frustrated because you've had stool testing run and it does not show parasites, so you assume you don't have parasites, you're probably going to discover in our chat today that test may not be accurate. So I'm joined again by Jennifer Brand. She's a clinical nutritionist who works with kids, babies, infants, and up to the mid-teens. And I work with adults, mid-teens, all the way up to the end of life. And so we're really excited to be here because we both work mostly with chronic skin issues, but yet we have plenty of folks that are finding that there's connections throughout the body, especially the gut-skin connection that can hold a lot of answers for people who are searching on their skin healing journeys. So Jen, it's great to have you back. I would love to ask you, especially since you work with kids and we both do stool testing in our practices, what's your overall feeling of stool testing? And I'm going to say PCR stool testing, so a lot of these more integrative or functional type stool tests in terms of finding parasites.
Yes. So thank you for having me back. I'm really excited to have this conversation today because parasites are something that, as you all are going to learn more today, they are something that don't show up readily on the PCR, the comprehensive digestive stool testing, that I really promote in my practice. And it really is a key tool for getting to the root cause of the problem for your child, if you're an adult as well. But it really is a key tool for helping solve the problem with what's happening on the skin. Yet, when it comes to identifying parasites, it is not super effective for that purpose.
So have you found parasites in kids whose stool tests you've run?
Oh, absolutely. And I find this interesting. Many years ago, before I was focused in my practice 100% on children, I did work with adults. And I would say, and I don't have like hard data on this, but if I had to say, I would say that I more often do see parasitic findings in children compared to when I was working with adults. I think part of the reason is that kids they're crawling on the ground, they're playing in the dirt, they have their hands in the mouth. Hygiene isn't necessarily a priority for children as it is for adults. So they are more likely to become contaminated or infected with something like a parasite. So I think that is something that parents should keep in mind also.
I will say that in terms of adults, I don't see parasites very often. The most common type of parasite, and we spoke in our other episode where we were hashing it out about parasites and chronic skin problems, that I probably see more protozoa, which are the single cell organisms. I have never seen on like a functional stool test that's a PCR variety, I have never seen a worm show up. I have two colleagues who could both attest that they have had one test show up with some type of worm show up on it. That's it. In all these years I've been doing it. So I generally think that it is a huge mistake to assume that because your stool test looks clear, that you should assume there's no problem there. That like, okay, we'll trust the result, which I think is actually a pretty big mistake. And I don't understand. It's very frustrating to me why. I just don't get why these stool tests aren't picking them up. I had one colleague on the Healthy Skin show she talked about worms specifically and said that they start to degrade. So sometimes they just will not show up on a stool test. But a PCR stool test is really sequencing other things. It's not looking, there's no microscopic component. So I don't know. I would say, I can't give you a hard percentage, but I find that out of the clients who have negative stool tests, I would say probably about 50% actually do have some sort of parasitic problem. There are other types of stool tests, and we'll go through a bunch of things, like microscopic exams. Do you ever do microscopic exams, Jen, or recommend those?
I haven't at this stage.
For kids.
And backing up a little bit with the PCR test, I do see, and there is a test that I use in particular. So of course it's not going to look for every single thing. I do see Giardia pop up on there. It's infrequent, but probably more frequent than most people would like to believe. Another common one that I see on there is the D. fragilis. So that often, though, and this can be a clue, so if your child does have the D. fragilis on the PCR testing, that often comes along with pinworms. So what I really look for on the testing are sort of these connections between history and clues to gather a more comprehensive picture of what is likely really happening underneath the surface, as opposed to putting kids through more and more and more testing, because it is harder for children, especially a lot of the kids I work with are so little, in diapers, and it makes it a little more challenging sometimes to collect samples. So I do use more history as well as signs and symptoms as well to identify a lot of these things.
This episode is brought to you by my skincare line, Dermaquell. The beauty of these skincare products are that they are especially crafted for those struggling with chronic skin rash issues based on my research and clinical experience from my private practice. They focus on organic ingredients that are clean, like zinc, aloe, and hemp oil, that support and calm rashed, dry, angry skin. There's no unnecessary chemicals or additives that can further dry out your skin or mess with your hormones. And I'm so excited for you to add these creams into your routine. Check them out at quellshop.com and use the coupon code GET15OFF to get 15% off your first order. I'll put a link in the description below, and now let's jump back to the video.
Yeah, I would say with the microscopic exam, so that's literally, so everyone, it's where you take your poop, they smear it across a slide, and they look at it under a microscope and see what's there, what's wiggling around, so to speak. And so those are not foolproof either. I think it's important to know that at this point in time, while yes, stool testing is better than it was, it's not perfect. So it's still possible to miss things. But in more microscopic exams, we've had clients who've found to have nematodes, which are basically like, larval nematodes, which are like baby worms or helminths. And that for us is pretty significant, because when we have clients who are on like IL-13 blockers, like Dupixent and Adbry for atopic dermatitis or eczema, you're not supposed to be on those medications. If you have a helminth infection, it's a warning on the product label. And so they can then bring that back to their doctor and get treatment for the worm. So a lot of times we find that that's one of the benefits, is that it's because it's more understood and more accepted on a conventional side. It can also help improve the doctor being willing to treat them. And also, a lot of times these individuals, and one of the reasons we'll look, is that the medication itself is like not doing what it's supposed to do. They still have like uncontrollable rashes. So they're on a biologic drug, and they're using steroids, and they're using tacrolimus, and they're still really miserable. And so, that's where this is helpful and can at least what I've seen in a number of cases, can actually help the medication start to do what it's supposed to do once they actually deal with this underlying problem. So that's just been one thing in my clinical experience. Again, not foolproof. And I know it's super gross, the idea of thinking about like somebody looking at your poop under a microscope, but you know, it's answers. And I think that in itself can be really helpful for people. And Jen, I don't know too what your thoughts are on this. Like in terms of those PCR stool tests, I really find too, if there's a very like extremely high secretory IgA, for me, that is a red flag, especially if I don't see anything that would really explain why it is so like off the charts high. So that's one red flag. Is there anything else that like sometimes you might see? I know you mentioned D. fragilis, which is a protozoa. Is there anything else on some of these stool tests that might kind of like point you in the direction?
Yes, I do want to back up. So you mentioned Dupixent. So Dupixent is now approved for kids 6 months and older. So a lot of really young children are starting Dupixent. So it is something to keep in mind. And again, children are more likely to have these things happening, which has been my experience in my practice. So it might be very worthwhile if your child, you know, is going to start Dupixent, that you do explore getting some of the microscopic type of testing done to make sure that there isn't a deeper problem happening before they start the Dupixent. And
it's a helmet. It is a helmet. I literally just double checked because I don't deal with pinworms, so it would be one that would qualify under that. The helmets are worms. It's just like, I know it sounds gross. All the different
families and categories.
Exactly.
But there's another thing. Okay, so yes. Okay, so I'll answer your question first, because then I want to talk about pinworms a little bit more, because those are super contagious too. So we should talk about that, especially in children. But so on the PCR stool testing, there is a marker. I don't know if it's on all of them, but at least on some of them, the eosinophil activation protein. So when I see that high, that's also a sign to me. Often, if there's an H. pylori finding, and it doesn't necessarily have to be flagged as high, if it's even detected, I consider that a problem. H. pylori often comes along with something parasitic happening. So those are just some of the clues I look for. I agree, the secretory IgA that's high, that can also be another sign. So on some of these, the PCR stool testing, there's like the immune response section. So that's where you find like the secretory IgA and like the eosinophil activation protein. So if that section, sometimes it's like lit up like a Christmas tree, you know, I see. And whereas the rest of the test, it's kind of like nothing on there really explains why the section is so just like hyper stimulated. So in cases like that, there's something that we're not detecting, which often, you know, could be parasites. And so that's where, you know, we can dig deeper, and where a really in-depth health history assessment comes into play. If your child is really young, are there other siblings in the household, pets, you know, other things going on that might contribute to a potential parasitic infection? Also, something else that I see a lot in children, because a lot of kids that are struggling with chronic skin rashes, in particular eczema, they explore the allergy route, environmental allergies, food allergies. So they go through all of this testing. And, you know, eczema in particular is not commonly associated with food allergies. They are two separate conditions. So kids with eczema are more likely to have food allergies, but food allergies don't really cause the rashes. But anyway, that said, so a lot of these kids go in for allergy testing. And so often they find that there are no identified allergies, yet they have really high levels of IgE, like total IgE, and also like really high, like absolute eosinophils. So when I see that on blood testing, that can actually be a sign of an underlying parasitic infection as well.
Yes. And that has happened. So I had a client, an adult. She had a like life-threatening nut allergy, but she had avoided tree nuts like really, really well. They're not in her house, nothing, for like 10 years. And her total IgE was high. I don't remember. I think she had elevated eosinophils as well. She came back. Now, the PCR stool test did actually pick up, I think it was Blastocystis hominis, which is a protozoa. We talked about that in our last episode on parasites. And she brought it back to her doctor. Doctor didn't believe the accuracy of the PCR stool test and asked her to do one at a local lab. Well, that came back actually even higher. And so the doctor agreed to treat her, and she did notice a pretty sizable improvement, not 100% clearance or anything, and she still got other issues that we're working on, but a really good improvement in many of her symptoms. And so they wanted to blame the elevated, because I was looking at her blood work and I'm like, why is your total IgE still so high if you don't have any other allergies and you've avoided this for 10 years? This doesn't make any sense. And that was how we sort of figured things out for her. I also wanted to add, there is another blood test, and it is more general in nature. It's called the eosinophil cationic protein. I've had a couple of doctors run this on their patients who they just had very weird autoimmune symptoms. It wasn't something I suggested. It was literally their own idea, which is how I came to learn about it. It doesn't point to a specific type of organism. Obviously, there has to be some interaction. Not all parasites interact or cause an increasing of eosinophils. So you can't say, oh, if my eosinophils are low, I don't have a parasite. Not all parasites. So parasites, some presence of some parasites will increase eosinophils, but not all. And so anyway, that could also be something you could potentially ask for. And then Jen, with the pinworms, what are some ways that you could test for that? I mean, do you need to test for it?
More often than not, you don't need to test because you can actually see these things in your kids' poop. So you can actually see these things. They are extremely contagious. I had a client a number of years ago, and we were already working together, but then they, frantically sent me a message one day with another child in the classroom, was diagnosed, had pinworms, and her kid was playing with that kid the day before in the sandbox. I'm like, go to your doctor, get everybody in the house, go get the medication to treat this. But pinworms are extremely contagious, and everybody that has been in contact with the infected person really should get tested and or treated, because those things can continue to get passed.
And when you say passed, you also mean passed to adults?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right. Good for everybody
absolutely.
To know.
We share with the ones we love. So we do.
Passing the pinworms around.
These things get passed around. I think we talked about this last time when we talked on the subject, and I mentioned this, and it was so funny because my mom did tell me after the fact. So when I was a child, I vaguely remembered like my brother having worms, and the rest of us had to get treated for it. So yes, my mom did confirm that. So my brother did have worms when he was a child, so we all had to get treated because my brother had some worms.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I wanted to mention one thing that I thought of when you were talking about the allergies, because I think this is really interesting. So as we know, other people out there probably know some of this too, but there is some cross-reactivity between allergens. So we've got like the food pollen reactivity allergens and things like that. There is a cross-reactivity between a certain type of parasite, forget the name of it, but with shellfish. So if you have a shellfish allergy, is it the shellfish or could it be a parasite? It actually could be a parasitic infection.
I have read a few more recent studies on some cross-reactivity between, and I apologize, I don't know the exact, I don't know if it was strongyloides, like there's all these different types of parasites. And so I found that fascinating because there were certain things that show up as an allergy, but in reality, the question was, is it actually cross-reactivity because they have this underlying infection? and yet it's presenting as like an allergy to some sort of food. So that is really interesting. I also think, and this is harder to get, and it's not something you can order yourself, but if you do go to an immunologist, if the doctor feels like you would be a worthy candidate for a referral like that. And sometimes a regular doctor will do this, but not always. It's really hard for us to have clients get the doctors to run these. There are parasitic immunology panels that can be run. They're blood tests. So they're looking for like the IgA, the IgM, like all that kind of stuff. And they're looking at very specific types of parasites. And this is, again, at regular labs across the country in the US. So it's not like this is a strange panel. You can look this up. So I had a client who I had told her, I said, listen, I really think you should do the microscopic exam. And she said, okay, well, why don't you give me the other list and I'm going to go back to my doctor and see what she'll do. And the reason that I asked her to do this is because she had a long-standing history of eczema in very strange spots and severe asthma. Like I think at one point she was doing 2 different inhalers and it just kept getting worse and worse. And she just was so reactive to things. She had hives, she had all sorts of stuff. And so the doctor actually did run the panel. And when she sent the results to me, I was perplexed because and I was just like, listen, you have to go back to the doctor. I can't read this to you, but I can at least just tell you what I see. And she had something show up positive for a type of parasite that typically impacts the lungs. And she had really, really bad asthma. And I said, listen, you got to go back and talk to your doctor. And I don't know if there's another way for them to verify that this is accurate. I don't know, but I think it's a good reminder that parasites move. They don't necessarily all stay in one spot. Some do live in the GI tract and just hang out there, but others can go to other organ systems. I know this is kind of like a gross conversation. Like sometimes I just feel gross thinking about parasites. Like I don't know, the worms thing just grosses me out. And I'm saying that as a person that like, I live in this world. I do genuinely enjoy it, but the idea of worms does gross me out. So if it does you too, like I got it. I gotcha. I understand. But they move. They don't always, everything doesn't necessarily just stay in one spot. So right. That's just
which is another reason why with like the PCR test, for example, or any stool test we're doing, we're looking for these types of microorganisms in the intestinal tract, and they might not be in the intestinal tract. So
no.
Yeah. So which is where it also becomes really important to understand holistically what's going on.
Yeah. Jen, the other thing I just thought of too that could be helpful is, and this is all looking at the full case, right? Because I think that's important. We talked a lot about that. If you're coming into this conversation here and you're going, wait, I feel like there was another conversation. There was a conversation that predates this with Jen and I talking about signs and symptoms of parasites and all sorts of things. But another thing to consider is if you have low vitamin B12 and low iron, sometimes that can be a sign. Now that's tricky because you could have H. pylori, you could have GI disease that causes low absorption or poor absorption. But I do think that if you look at the details and really digging into that history and the different complaints and the different lifestyle choices, like eating sushi all the time of raw fish, that can be a sign that could help us figure out. I know you're like, that's me eating this sushi.
And if you have pets and kiss them on the mouth.
Yes, that's another red flag. But I do think that those are things to consider. And I wanted to ask you, so in babies and children, where you do either absolutely find like protozoa or you suspect a parasite infection lurking under the surface, do they always have GI issues or is it sometimes not? Sometimes
not. I would say it's probably about maybe maybe close to 50-50 of the kids in my practice, whether or not they have any GI symptoms at all. We can have a whole nother conversation about GI symptoms because a lot of people don't understand. And most of the time it's leaning towards constipation, and constipation can take many different forms. So a lot of times people report no GI issues when there's something happening on the skin, but then after, we do the assessment in the intake and start having these conversations, the child is not pooping every day. Maybe they're pooping a lot throughout the day, but that can be incomplete evacuation, which is also a form of constipation. So, but often, so even with those things happening, parents might not recognize that those are GI issues. And also kids sometimes are so little, so it's really hard to tell the signs if they are. Sometimes if your baby is really little and they're like arching their back or, seem uncomfortable, things like that, that could be a sign of GI discomfort. But, not always. I have just as many kids and, parents in my practice that report that normal, healthy bowel movement every day. If you've seen the Bristol stool chart, it's right smack in the middle where it should be, So often there are no GI symptoms that are identified at all, yet when we do the testing that we do, when we start doing the assessments, there are all sorts of imbalances that can be related to what's happening in the gut, even in the absence of any gut symptoms.
And I see that in adults as well. I have learned, I think it's an interesting conversation to talk about the fact that we're always looking for something wrong in order to justify looking in a particular area. And so historically, when you and I both graduated from grad school and we started our practices, we both worked with more gut cases. And typically I always thought, if you have gut dysfunction, gas, bloating, discomfort, diarrhea, all that stuff, something must be wrong. But with skin problems, it's not always the case. So the same with adults. I have had clients who have full body eczema and they have massive dysbiosis. So their gut microbiome is a mess and they might have parasites and fungal overgrowth and all sorts of things. They have no GI symptoms at all, which it's wild. And I don't know why the inflammation is showing up as the skin and maybe they're fatigued and all sorts of things, but it's just not. So I want to caution anyone listening to this and thinking, I don't have any gut issues. I don't have any gut symptoms. Like you were saying, Jen, I'm 3 to 4 on the Bristol stool chart. I go to the bathroom like clockwork. I don't have any gas or bloating. That does not mean if you have eczema, psoriasis, rosacea, especially like urticaria or hives, dermatographia, a lot of these skin issues, there is an interesting dance between what's happening in the gut and the skin. And that's why there is more research being done on that gut-skin axis. So I just want to, I don't want people to dismiss things simply because they don't have any huge red flags that impact their daily life that make them think that there could be a problem in the gut. And this is something you and I both have private practice. So we see clients one-on-one and we do group programs. And this is a chronic misunderstanding of that everybody must have gut symptoms to have a gut problem. And that's just simply not true.
Yeah. And something I don't know, I just thinking about the difference between, because I do see some clients that have just gut issues. The way I look at it is that skin problems are a more severe manifestation of gut issues. And just kind of thinking and back to some of the more recent clients that I've worked with, and again, this is more of a generalization, but I would say off the top of my head, I feel like the findings on a PCR stool test for people with skin issues, even in the absence of gut problems, has more lit up like a Christmas tree than people that just have the gut issues. So I do see more dysbiosis, more, imbalances in people with skin issues compared to people who have, gut issues as their primary concern. And, I think that is really important to understand, whether somebody has gut symptoms or not, whatever's happening on the skin, we think of that as it's an inflammatory health problem. And when we're talking about inflammation, that is the immune system kind of gone haywire, right? And causing this inflammation. And a huge reason why we look at the gut is because 70% of the immune system is located in the gut. So it is a huge source of underlying inflammation that very often goes missed and undetected and unaddressed, which is why people continue to struggle and suffer with what's happening on their skin, because they're not looking at what's happening in the gut. And again, often that is because they don't have any gut symptoms. So they're not connecting those dots.
Yeah. Oh, one final thing that just popped into my head that could be helpful. There's a interesting interplay between fungal problems, so like candida overgrowth, and parasites. And so I just want to throw this out there for people that are doing like these candida cleanses, or you're doing a candida protocol, and then suddenly you start breaking out in hives and welts. Candida and fungal organisms produce biofilms. So it's sort of like they produce this like force field in front of them to they're backed up against the wall of your gut, and it has this force field, and as the medication, antifungal meds come down, and as the different herbal products you might use come down the digestive tube, it's like they don't exist. It passes by without injuring them. Anyway, long story short, parasites can sometimes hide behind those biofilms. And so it's not uncommon that you're in the midst of doing this. You might be like 4, 5, 6 weeks in, and then all of a sudden start developing urticaria out of nowhere. That's usually a red flag that there was some sort of parasitic issue. I mean, if you rule out other allergies and you're like, for sure it wasn't that you ate something that you're suddenly allergic to or what have you, and you're not, I put on a pair of pants, it was super dusty and old, and you have a dust mite allergy, right? But so nothing like that you could really point to. That's where you should start thinking that there's probably parasites lurking under the system that kind of got let loose a little bit.
Yes. So, which actually I've had a few clients, and I think that this is more common in adults, but I have had some parents ask me about this, biofilm busters. So there are some supplements out there. Okay. Mm-hmm. Number one, I said that, don't do this on your own. Like, don't do that.
Yeah, I agree. Don't do it.
Don't do it. Because exactly what can happen is it can make things much worse, because you're breaking that shield, and the microbes, the candida, the parasites, all of it can just come rushing out and overwhelm the body and cause horrible reactions. And that can be even more pronounced in children, because little bodies don't detox as effectively as bigger ones. So it's hard enough in adults to manage that and to use things like that. In children, it can be even more problematic. So just something to keep in mind. Like you mentioned biofilm, and I know some people out there, because a lot of you out there, I know you do your research, so you know these things. Yeah. But biofilm busters, like you want to be just work with a practitioner, like talk to somebody. Don't DIY that, please.
No, and I rarely use biofilm busters in my practice, because I'm sort of the mindset that the journey is like an onion. Mm-hmm. And you should peel it back in layers, because ideally I want clients to be comfortable through and when I say comfortable, I mean like you're not worse, like you slowly inch your way towards better health. You feel like every day a little better, which is great. But the biofilm buster thing, people are like, oh, I read that I should do a biofilm buster. And I'm like, okay, so if you're already this flared up, there's this much inflammation from what your body can see. What do you think is going to happen when you open the floodgates? And that's where I've gotten emails from readers and listeners who are like, I think that I can't even tell you how many times I've had emails that say, I think I broke myself. I took a biofilm buster because I read about this online, or they had they met with somebody who suggested it, but they really weren't working closely with that individual, and like literally everything exploded. So I concur.
Yeah, which can also, and I have a lot of parents that have come to me, they've seen other practitioners, or they're just trying to do it on their own, and they're introducing antimicrobials and just throwing things, not just throwing things, but introducing things to their child. Yeah. In some cases, they've been recommended to do this, and there is an order of operations that you have to introduce things in order to prevent things from getting worse. And again, yes, things can always, go up and down, but they should not send you or your child into something that is already worse than it has been. If it is done in the right way, in an organized manner, in a particular order that takes the steps of how the body functions into account, you should not have a severe flare, and things really should not get worse before they get better.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Jen, I'm so glad that we could have this part 2 conversation all about parasites. All about parasites. So where can everyone find you?
So you can find me. My website is jenniferkarenbrandnutrition.com. I'm also on Instagram at Jennifer Karen Brand. The Karen is actually spelled funny. It's Caryn. But either way, it's the same way on my website, but I also have the regular way. So either way, if you punch in Jennifer Karen Brand Nutrition, you'll find my website. And then Instagram is the Jennifer Caryn Brand. And find me there as well.
And you're also, if people are interested in connecting with you too, about you do like webinars and things like that, they could go to, it's conqueryourchildsrashes.com, correct?
Yes, it is. Yes, the conqueryourchildsrashes.com. So I have some complimentary free trainings coming up. So those are happening really soon. And I also run a live group program. So that's coming up soon as well. And then of course I always have opportunities to work with me privately.
Yeah. Awesome. And as you guys know, if you've tuned in before, obviously we have the whole Healthy Skin Show podcast. I think we've got over 350 episodes at this point that come out weekly. And we've got a bunch of guides for you to check out if you're looking for answers for those root cause issues and you're an adult. You're an adult, because that's who I work with. You can go to stopmyrashesnow.com and I'll walk you through the step-by-step process of very simply how to look at what's happening to you from that outside in, inside out perspective and start getting answers then based on your particular skin diagnosis from a more functional and integrative nutrition perspective. So thank you guys so much for joining us today. Jen, thanks for being here. I appreciate you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you.
If you enjoyed this video, you need to tune in to this video next. Then make sure to hit the subscribe button so you get notified as soon as a new episode drops. I'm excited to see you there and dive deeper with you on your skin healing journey.